This is unacceptable behavior!
You need to calm down right now! Daddy, I love my boy. Please, I need to talk to you.
He was not good enough or not acceptable.
We need to understand what's happening here. This behavior isn't like you.
I know it's been tough, but
Thank you. It means everything to me. Daddy, I love my boy. Please, I need to talk to you.
her parents said he was not good enough.
We're taught that excellence is a passport, that if you speak clearly, show up on time, dress correctly, and follow every unspoken rule, the doors will eventually open. This story begins at the moment that myth collapses. Not in a courtroom or a classroom, but on a quiet suburban porch, under a flickering light, where politeness becomes a weapon and authority doesn't need to raise its voice to be absolute. This isn't a story about teenage romance. It's about the difference between being allowed in public spaces and being permitted in private ones. About how respectability functions as a test you're encouraged to take, even when the outcome has already been decided. It's about learning, far too early, that performance can earn tolerance, but it cannot override lineage, fear, or inherited power. Because sometimes the lesson isn't that you failed to measure up. It's that the measurement itself was never designed to include you. And the quiet click of a door closing can teach you more about how the world works than any lecture ever could. The porch light flickered on with an audible hum, casting a harsh, artificial yellow cone over the slate-gray steps where I stood, turning the pristine suburban twilight into an interrogation room. It was November in Virginia, the kind of cold that doesn't just sit on your skin but burrows into your marrow, finding the spaces between your ribs where your anxiety lives. I checked my watch, a cheap Casio I had polished with a microfiber cloth until the scratches faded, and saw it was exactly 7 o'clock. I was not early, which would have looked desperate, and I was not late, which would have confirmed every silent stereotype they already held about boys like me. I was precisely on time, a calculated metric of respectability that I had been taught to wield like a shield. My hand hovered over the brass knocker, trembling not from the chill, but from the terrifying weight of the silence behind that heavy oak door. Inside was the girl who had passed me notes in AP English written on torn notebook paper, the girl whose laugh sounded like wind chimes in a storm, the girl who swore her parents were different. But standing there, separated by 3 inches of expensive wood and 300 years of history, I knew the difference between being tolerated in a classroom and being welcomed into a home. When the door finally opened, it wasn't her face I saw, but the broad, flannel-clad chest of her father, a man who looked at me not with anger, but with a terrifying, polite confusion, as if I were a delivery driver who had arrived at the wrong address entirely. He didn't invite me in. That was the first signal, the breaking of the social contract that governs polite society. Usually, the door opens wide, a gesture of hospitality that predates language, but he held the doorframe with one hand and the knob with the other, creating a physical barricade with his body. The warmth from the foyer spilled out around him, smelling of pot roast and scented candles, a sensory assault of domestic comfort that I was explicitly being denied. I could see the edge of a staircase and a framed family photo on the wall, a glimpse of a life that was aggressively normal and yet completely alien to the reality I was currently inhabiting. I cleared my throat, forcing my voice to drop an octave, stripping away any slang, any cadence that might betray my background, utilizing the code-switching mechanism I had perfected since kindergarten. I introduced myself, extending a hand that remained hovering in the cold air, ignored. He looked at my hand, then back at my face, his eyes narrowing slightly, not with malice, but with a clinical assessment. It was the look a banker gives a loan application he intends to deny, a look that measures value and finds a deficit. "Sarah," I said, asking if she was ready. The mention of her name seemed to tighten the air between us. He didn't turn his head, didn't call for her. He simply stood there, a guardian of the gate, and delivered a sentence that was so quiet I almost missed it over the sound of the wind rattling the dry oak leaves in the yard. He told me that she wouldn't be coming out tonight. He didn't say she was sick. He didn't say she was grounded. He offered no convenient lie to spare my dignity, which was the cruelest part of the interaction. A lie would have been a kindness. A lie would have implied that he cared enough about my feelings to protect them. Instead, he offered the raw, unvarnished truth of his authority. He told me that he didn't think it was appropriate for us to be spending time together outside of school hours. The distinction was sharp and surgical. Inside the school, under the watchful eye of the state and the bell schedule, we were peers. Outside, on this porch, in the real world where lineages and legacies are protected, I was a threat. I remember the feeling of my best shirt, the one I had ironed for 20 minutes until the collar was stiff as cardboard, suddenly feeling like a costume. I had dressed for the part of the respectable young man, the scholar, the athlete, the exception to the rule. I had believed, with the naive arrogance of youth, that excellence was a currency that could buy entry into any room. If I spoke well enough, dressed well enough, achieved enough, the melanin in my skin would become a secondary characteristic, a trivial detail like eye color or height. But as I stood there, the cold seeping through the soles of my shoes, I realized that my currency was counterfeit here. To him, my good grades and my polite demeanor weren't evidence of my character. They were anomalies that failed to outweigh the perceived liability of my race. I wasn't being rejected for something I had done, I was being rejected for who I was, a variable that could not be fixed, edited, or improved. Then, I saw her. For a split second, in the space between his arm and the doorframe, Sarah appeared at the bottom of the stairs. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, and she looked small. She didn't wave. She didn't run to the door. She just stood there, paralyzed by the impossible choice between the boy she loved and the father who defined her world. In that moment, the romantic narrative I had constructed in my head, the one where love conquers all, shattered against the hard reality of power dynamics. Her father shifted his weight, blocking my view of her, effectively erasing her from the equation. He told me it was time to leave, his voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel. He closed the door, not with a slam, but with a soft, decisive click. The sound echoed in the stillness of the neighborhood, louder than a gunshot. I was left alone on the slate steps, the porch light clicking off a second later, plunging me back into the darkness, leaving me to walk back to my car with the heavy, suffocating realization that I could be perfect, I could be brilliant, and I could be kind, but in the eyes of the world that mattered, I would still simply be not good enough. The engine turned over with a hesitation that mirrored my own heart. A mechanical stumble before the hum of the sedan filled the silent cul-de-sac. I did not speed away. That would have been what they expected, a confirmation of the volatility they silently attributed to boys like me. Instead, I drove with a precise, agonizing slowness, keeping the speedometer exactly at the limit, navigating the winding geometry of a neighborhood designed to keep the outside world at bay. The streetlights flickered past in a rhythmic strobe, illuminating the manicured lawns and the grand, colonial facades that stood like fortresses of a life I was currently being exiled from. It was in the quiet of that cabin, with the smell of old upholstery and the ghost of her perfume still clinging to my jacket, that the numbness began to recede, replaced by a cold, intellectual clarity. The rejection on the porch was not merely a heartbreak. It was a transaction. It was the collection of a debt I did not know I owed, a levy placed upon my existence in their world. We often speak of taxes in the financial sense, the government taking its share of labor, but there is a more insidious levy known intimately by those of us who navigate spaces where we are the exception. This is the black tax. It is not paid in currency, but in psychological erosion. It is the surcharge of emotional labor required to make the majority feel comfortable with your presence. It is the requirement to be exceptional just to be considered average, to be flawless just to be considered safe. As I turned onto the main avenue, leaving the enclave of wealth behind, I realized I had been paying this tax my entire academic life without ever auditing the cost. I thought back to the countless moments that had led to that porch. The times I moderated my volume in the cafeteria so as not to be seen as rowdy. The times I dressed in layers of non-threatening preppy aesthetics, armor disguised as fashion, to ensure that when I walked into a store, the security guard saw a student rather than a suspect. The father did not need to use a slur to put me in my place. He used the most polite, civilized tools available to him: concern, paternal duty, and the unspoken implication of incompatibility. This is the genius of the modern exclusion. It does not scream. It whispers. It hides behind the veneer of cultural fit and family values. The black tax is the energy you spend deciphering these whispers, the mental bandwidth consumed by analyzing every microinteraction to determine if you are being tolerated or accepted. I had spent years believing that if I paid enough of this tax, if I accumulated enough receipts of excellence, politeness, and assimilation, I would eventually purchase my admission into full humanity in their eyes. That night, as the car merged onto the highway that separated my side of town from hers, I understood the bankruptcy of that strategy. You cannot buy your way into a heart that views your very existence as a depreciation of value. The ledger is rigged. No matter how much you pay, the balance always remains outstanding. This realization did not come as a single wave, but as a series of crashing memories, 3 specific lessons that I had failed to fully understand until this moment. There is an open loop in the narrative of the minority experience, a question that hangs over every interaction. What is the price of admission today? To understand why that door clicked shut, and why it sounded so final, you have to understand the 3 pillars of the tax I had been paying. These are not just stories of high school angst, they are the structural blueprints of how hope gets dismantled. I need to tell you about the classroom, where I learned that my intelligence was a party trick rather than a trait. I need to tell you about the locker room, where I learned that my physical body was a commodity to be cheered for, but not a vessel to be loved. And I need to tell you about the dinner table, not hers, but the theoretical one I had prepared myself for, where I learned that code switching is a language that eventually leaves you with no native tongue. These 3 lessons formed the curriculum of my adolescence, a silent education that ran parallel to my actual studies. I had excelled at the coursework, but I had failed the exam of reality. The tension sitting in my chest that night wasn't just sadness. It was the terrifying vertigo of realizing that the map I had been using was drawn by the people who built the maze. I was lost, not because I didn't know where I was, but because I finally understood exactly where they had placed me. The library became my cathedral, a silent sanctuary where the air always smelled of dust and binding glue, and the only liturgy was the relentless scratching of my pen against college-ruled paper. I retreated into this fortress of solitude not because I had a burning passion for calculus or European history, but because I had discovered a terrifying logic that I believed would save me. If the world decided to judge me based on the melanin in my skin, I would force it to judge me on the merit of my mind. This was the defense of excellence. It is a strategy born of desperation, a silent pact made by marginalized children who believe that if they can just stack enough trophies, diplomas, and accolades high enough, they can build a wall that racism cannot scale. I approached my high school existence like a soldier preparing for a war that no one else could see. Every test score below 95% felt like a physical blow, a chink in the armor that would leave me vulnerable to the skepticism of her parents. I was not merely studying for a grade. I was curating an irrefutable dossier of my own humanity. I believed that if I could become the valedictorian, the team captain, and the debate champion, I would transform from a statistical probability into an exception. I wanted to be so undeniably good that denying me entry into their family would feel like a logical fallacy rather than a social preference. The mornings began in the pitch black of 4 o'clock, a time when the rest of the world was afforded the luxury of dreams, while I was already awake, performing calisthenics on the cold floor of my bedroom. I sculpted my body with the same obsessive rigor I applied to my mind. On the track field, I ran until my lungs burned and my vision blurred at the edges, fueled by an anger I could not articulate. When I crossed the finish line ahead of the pack, the cheers from the stands washed over me, but they felt distant, like noise filtered through water. I knew they were cheering for the jersey, for the points, for the spectacle of black athleticism that has always been palatable to the suburban gaze. They loved the speed, but I wondered if they feared the momentum. I remember looking up into the bleachers during a homecoming game, scanning the sea of faces for her parents, wondering if a touchdown would be enough to buy me a seat at their dinner table. I was trading sweat for acceptance, bartering physical excellence for the basic right to be seen as a suitable partner for their daughter. It was an exhausting economy, an inflation of expectations where the price of admission kept rising the harder I worked. Inside the classroom, the pressure was a different kind of violence. I sat in the front row of advanced placement English, often the only face that looked like mine in a room of 30. I learned to speak with a cadence that was not my own, carefully enunciating every syllable to ensure that no slang, no vernacular, no trace of the culture that raised me could be used as evidence against my intelligence. I raised my hand for every question, not out of curiosity, but out of a need to preemptively strike down the assumption that I was there to fill a diversity quota. I became a master of the counter-narrative, striving to be the antithesis of every stereotype flashing across the evening news. But this performance of perfection created a profound loneliness. I could not share this burden with her. When we sat together in her car, her hand resting in mine, she would ask why I was always so tired, why I pushed myself so hard. She saw my ambition as a quirky personality trait, a drive to succeed. She did not understand that I was running for my life. I could not tell her that every apeless was a brick in the bridge I was trying to build across the chasm of race that separated our families. To tell her would be to shatter the innocence of our romance, to drag the ugly politicization of my existence into the sanctuary of our love. So I carried it alone. I became a statue of my own making, polished and cold. The defense of excellence provided me with a shield, yes, but a shield is heavy, and you cannot embrace someone when your arms are full of armor. I began to realize that perfection is a binary state. You are either perfect, or you are a failure. There is no middle ground for the boy who is trying to prove he belongs. The tragedy of this defense mechanism is that it hollows you out. You spend so much time ensuring that you are unimpeachable that you forget to be a person. I was becoming a resume, a collection of data points designed to pass an inspection, rather than a young man in love. And even as the acceptances from universities started rolling in, and the medals accumulated on my dresser, the dread remained. I had done everything right. I had followed the rules. I had exceeded every standard set before me. But in the quiet moments between the studying and the training, a haunting question whispered in the back of my mind. What if I lay all these achievements at their feet, and they still look at me and see nothing but a boy who doesn't belong? The defense of excellence relies on the premise that the opposition values quality. I was beginning to suspect that they only valued exclusion. The mahogany grandfather clock in the foyer of her parents' house did not just tell time, it dictated the rhythm of my existence the moment I crossed their threshold. Every tick was a reminder that I was burning daylight, that my presence here was temporary, probationary, and strictly monitored. I learned very quickly that survival in her world required a specific physiological adjustment, a mechanism I came to call the internal volume knob. This was not merely about the decibel level of my voice, though that was certainly the first thing to go. It was a total modulation of my frequency. It was a dial located somewhere deep behind my sternum, connected by raw nerves to my throat, my spine, and my hands, and whenever I stepped onto their plush Persian rugs, I instinctively reached inside and turned myself down. I dialed back the bass in my laughter until it became a polite, acceptable tenor. I restricted the amplitude of my gestures, keeping my elbows tucked near my ribs as if I were navigating a crowded elevator, even when I was sitting in a room spacious enough to house my entire family's apartment. I had to become a low-fidelity version of myself, stripped of all the static, the soul, and the resonance that might cause feedback in their perfectly curated lives. Dinner at her house was the ultimate testing ground for this self-erasure. The dining room was always freezing, a deliberate, sterile chill that kept everyone upright and alert. I remember sitting across from her father, a man whose silence was heavier than most men's shouting. He would slice his steak with surgical precision, the silver knife scraping against the bone china, a screeching sound that made my teeth ache, and then he would look up, fork suspended, to ask me a question. These were never simple inquiries, they were calibrating tests. He would ask about my neighborhood, not with curiosity, but with the clinical detachment of an anthropologist studying a compromised ecosystem. He would ask about my mother's job, his eyebrows raised in anticipation of a pitiful answer. And this is where the knob had to be adjusted with microscopic precision. If I spoke too passionately, I was aggressive. If I spoke too quietly, I was weak. If I used the vernacular of my home, I was uneducated. If I used the Queen's English too perfectly, I was trying too hard, a mimic in a rented tuxedo. I had to find the frequency of non-threatening competence. I became an expert in the neutral answer, the diplomatic deflection, the smile that didn't reach my eyes because my eyes were too busy scanning the room for threats. The tragedy of this performance was that it worked. I watched the tension leave her mother's shoulders when I successfully navigated a question about politics by offering a bland, centrist observation that offended no one and meant nothing. I saw the slight nod of approval from her father when I knew which fork to use for the salad. They were being lulled into a false sense of security, believing that I was one of the good ones, an exception to the rule they held in their minds. But the cost of that comfort was my own suffocation. I was actively participating in the dismantling of my own identity. I was editing my soul in real time. I remember looking over at Sarah during these meals. She would be laughing, talking with her mouth full, debating her father with a fiery intensity, spilling wine on the tablecloth without a second thought. She was allowed to be messy. She was allowed to be loud. She was allowed to occupy space without apologizing for the displacement of air. Her volume knob was broken off at the maximum setting, and they loved her for it. I, however, had to be a ghost in my own body. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones after 3 hours of code switching. It is not the tiredness of physical labor, but the deep, spiritual fatigue of holding your breath. When we would finally leave, stepping out into the cool night air, I would feel the sudden rush of blood returning to my extremities, as if a tourniquet had been removed. Sarah would squeeze my hand and tell me how great I was, how charming, how much they were starting to like me. She didn't understand that the boy they liked wasn't me. It was a carefully constructed avatar, a hollow shell designed to reflect their own values back at them. The internal volume knob protected me from their immediate rejection, but it exposed me to a far more insidious danger. I was beginning to forget what my own voice sounded like when it wasn't being filtered through the mesh of their expectations. I was winning the battle for their tolerance, but I was losing the war for my own dignity. I was becoming palatable, and in doing so, I was becoming invisible. The smell of cedar shavings and motor oil was a sharp, grounding corrective to the sterile lavender scent that permeated Sarah's foyer. I found myself sitting on an overturned milk crate in my Uncle Marcus's garage, watching him run a block plane over a piece of rough walnut. He was the keeper of our family's unwritten history, a man who had navigated the corporate hierarchies of the 70s and 80s with a stoicism that I was only beginning to comprehend. Here, amidst the hanging tools and the low hum of a jazz station on the radio, the mask I wore for Sarah's parents could finally be peeled away, leaving my skin raw and sensitive to the air. I had come here not for repair of a physical object, but because I felt structurally unsound, as if the foundation of my personality was buckling under the weight of constant, high-stakes performance. Marcus didn't look up from his work as he spoke, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the concrete floor. He asked me how the dinner went, but he didn't ask it like a question, he asked it like a diagnosis. I told him about the tightness in my chest, the way I curated every sentence before letting it escape my lips, and the exhaustion that settled into my bones the moment I drove away from their manicured lawn. I told him about the unspoken negotiation taking place across the dinner table, where my humanity was being weighed against their prejudice, and I was terrified the scale would tip the wrong way. Marcus stopped planing the wood and finally looked at me, his eyes dark and heavy with decades of similar calculations. He told me that I was describing the invisible architecture of integration, a blueprint he knew by heart. He explained that what I was experiencing was not just social anxiety, but a historical inheritance. He called it the tax of entry. He told me about his early days as one of the first black engineers at his firm, how he had to be twice as good to get half the credit, and how he had to laugh at jokes that weren't funny to ensure his colleagues felt comfortable enough to promote him. But then his expression hardened, and the nostalgia evaporated. He warned me that there is a profound difference between strategic silence and erasure. He pointed the block plane at me like an accusatory finger. He said that when you adjust yourself so much to fit into a space that wasn't built for you, you eventually forget the shape you were supposed to be. He told me that Sarah's parents weren't just asking for politeness, they were asking for a version of me that had no edges, no history, and no potential to disrupt their worldview. The lesson he offered was not one of submission, but of calibration. He spoke of the intergenerational link, the idea that my struggle was merely the latest iteration of a battle my ancestors had fought with far fewer resources. He reminded me that my grandfather didn't walk with his head down so that I could walk with my mouth shut. There was a specific dignity in his instruction, a counter-narrative to the one I had been telling myself. I had convinced myself that my chameleon act was a form of sophistication, a demonstration of my ability to code switch and adapt. Marcus shattered that illusion. He told me that true power isn't about blending in until you disappear. It is about standing out until they have no choice but to acknowledge the contrast. He picked up a piece of scrap wood, twisted and knotted, and held it up to the light. He said that the beauty of the wood is in the grain, in the history of its growth, in the flaws that prove it lived. By sanding myself down to a smooth, featureless surface for Sarah's parents, I was destroying the very grain that made me valuable. The garage felt smaller then, or perhaps I felt larger. The ambient dust motes dancing in the shaft of afternoon sunlight seemed to settle. I realized that my love for Sarah was real, but my strategy for defending it was flawed. I was trying to win a court case where the judge and jury were rigged against me by presenting evidence of my harmlessness. Marcus taught me that day that I needed to present evidence of my excellence, not as a plea for acceptance, but as a statement of fact. The mentor had handed me a lens through which to view my situation, transforming my anxiety into a quiet, simmering resolve. I wasn't just a boy trying to date a girl. I was the current bearer of a torch that had been carried through much darker nights than this one. The silence in the garage returned, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of responsibility. I knew then that the next time I walked into Sarah's house, I would not be walking in alone. I would be bringing Marcus, and my grandfather, and every silent sacrifice made before me. I would not turn the volume down. I would simply broadcast on a frequency they could not ignore. The humidity of late May hung heavy over the cul-de-sac, a stark contrast to the brittle, air-conditioned chill that greeted me the moment Sarah's mother opened the front door. This was not a casual visit, nor was it a date. It was a pre-graduation dinner, a formal obligation that felt more like a summons to a court-martial than a celebration of academic achievement. In the weeks following my time in the garage with Marcus, the internal landscape of my mind had shifted tectonically. I no longer walked up that driveway feeling like an imposter hoping to sneak past the guards. I walked up it like an ambassador from a foreign nation, carrying documents of state. The envelope in the inside pocket of my blazer felt heavier than paper had any right to be. It was my armor, my weapon, and my vindication all pressed into a single cream-colored rectangle. The dinner table was set with a kind of aggressive perfection that suggests a desperate need to maintain order. Crystal glasses aligned like sentries, silver forks spaced with mathematical precision, and a silence so profound that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a judge's gavel striking wood. Sarah sat across from me, her eyes darting between her father and the roast beef, visibly shrinking under the atmospheric pressure. She loved me, I knew that, but she was young, and the weight of her parents' disapproval was a gravity she hadn't yet learned to defy. Her father, a man whose handshake always felt like a test of grip strength rather than a greeting, began the interrogation before the salad course had even been cleared. He didn't look at me when he spoke. He looked at the space just above my left shoulder, as if addressing a ghost he wished would disappear. He asked about my plans for the autumn, his tone laced with the presumption of mediocrity. It was the same tone one might use to ask a child if they had remembered to wash their hands, an expectation of failure wrapped in a veneer of polite concern. This was the moment the black tax came due. He was expecting a community college, a trade apprenticeship, or perhaps a vague stutter about finding myself. He was waiting for the confirmation of his bias so he could comfortably categorize me as not good enough and sleep soundly in his prejudice. I reached into my pocket. The rustle of the paper was the only sound in the room, cutting through the ambient hum of the refrigerator. I didn't hand the letter to him. I placed it on the table, face up, and smoothed it flat with a deliberate, slow motion. It was an acceptance letter from a university that was older than the country itself, accompanied by a merit scholarship that covered tuition, room, and board, the kind of award reserved for the top fraction of the top 1%. I explained, in a voice that was terrifyingly calm even to my own ears, that I would be studying pre-law in the fall. I listed the details not as a boast, but as a dull recitation of facts, citing the statistics of the acceptance rate and the specifics of the fellowship. I watched the father's face as the information landed. It wasn't the look of a man who was happy for his daughter's boyfriend, it was the look of a man whose entire worldview was fracturing in real time. He picked up the letter, his fingers leaving a slight smudge on the embossed seal, and read it twice. He was looking for the mistake. He was looking for the quota, the affirmative action clause, the loophole that would allow him to dismiss my excellence as charity. But the receipts were watertight. The numbers were absolute. In that dining room, under the harsh light of the chandelier, the power dynamic inverted completely. For years, I had thought the tragedy of our relationship was that I wasn't enough for them. In that silence, watching him struggle to congratulate me through a jaw clenched tight enough to crack a tooth, I realized the true tragedy. They were too small for me. The moral victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like a funeral for a version of myself that used to care about their validation. Sarah reached out and touched my hand, her eyes shining with pride, but also with a dawning sadness. She saw it too. She saw that by proving I belonged in rooms her parents couldn't even pay to get into, I had essentially written my exit ticket from their lives. The receipts proved I was exceptional, and in their world, my exceptionalism was an affront. It was a mirror reflecting their own mediocrity back at them. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of polite noises and the scraping of silverware. I ate with the appetite of a man who had just finished a long, arduous journey. I had paid the tax. I had presented the receipt. And as I looked around that well-appointed room, at the fine china and the heavy drapes, I realized that none of it was impressive anymore. Marcus was right. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was filled with the undeniable, suffocating presence of my own dignity. I didn't need to raise my voice. The facts were screaming loud enough for all of us. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing the air-conditioned silence of their home away from the humid, chirping reality of the summer night. The sound was final, like the dropping of a gavel in a courtroom where the verdict had been rendered long before the trial began. I stood on that expansive brick porch for a moment, letting the residual tension in my shoulders dissipate into the darkness. The air outside smelled of freshly cut grass and impending rain, a stark contrast to the scent of potpourri and old money that permeated the dining room I had just exited. I looked down at my dress shoes, slightly scuffed at the toe, and realized that for the first time in months, I wasn't worried about whether they were polished enough. The performance was over. The curtain had fallen. I had delivered the lines, presented the evidence, and stood tall in the face of a polite, smiling interrogation. But standing there under the yellow glow of their porch light, I felt a profound sense of hollowness where the victory should have been. It wasn't the hollowness of defeat, but the empty space left behind when you finally discard a burden you were never meant to carry. Sarah slipped out the door a moment later, the latch clicking softly. She looked beautiful in the half-light, her face flushed, her eyes bright with a mixture of relief and adrenaline. She reached for my hand, her fingers interlacing with mine, a gesture that had once felt like an anchor but now felt like a tether to a sinking ship. She whispered that I had been amazing, that I had shown them, that her father was impressed even if he didn't say it. Her words tumbled out in a rush of optimism, painting a picture of a future where my acceptance letter to Harvard had magically dissolved centuries of systemic bias and personal prejudice. She believed that the meritocracy was real and that I had just bought my way in. She didn't understand that the currency I had paid with was pieces of my own soul, and the exchange rate was extortionate. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the innocence that shielded her. She could love me, yes, but she could never fully witness me. To her, the dinner was a difficult social hurdle we had cleared. To me, it was a confirmation that no matter how high I jumped, the ceiling in her world would always be just inches above my head, waiting to remind me of my place. I gently pulled my hand away, the friction of our palms separating sounding louder than the crickets in the hedges. I told her that I loved her, and the tragedy was that it was true. Our love was real, forged in the quiet corners of the library and the stolen moments between classes, but love is not a vacuum. It requires an atmosphere to breathe, and the air in her world was too thin for me. I explained, with a calmness that surprised even myself, that I couldn't spend the rest of my life auditing my existence for her parents' approval. I told her that being exceptional was my armor, but I didn't want to wear armor at the dinner table for the next 40 years. She started to cry, silent tears that tracked through her makeup, and I wanted to comfort her, but I knew that comforting her would mean compromising myself. We stood there for a long time, two teenagers on the precipice of adulthood, realizing that love is sometimes the casualty of a much older, uglier war. I kissed her forehead, a final benediction, and walked down the long, winding driveway toward my beat-up sedan. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and shadows. I turned off the radio, needing the silence to process the final lesson of this long, arduous curriculum. The black tax, I realized, isn't just about working twice as hard to get half as far. The tax is also the emotional labor of managing the comfort of those who underestimate you. It is the constant calibration of your tone, your volume, and your posture to ensure you don't appear threatening while simultaneously proving you are superior. I had paid that tax every day of my high school career. I had paid it with perfect grades, with extracurricular excellence, with a smile that never faltered. But as I merged onto the highway, watching the city skyline rise in the distance, I decided that the IRS of their expectations was closed for business. I was done filing returns. The acceptance letter sitting on my passenger seat was no longer a receipt to be presented to her father. It was a passport to a land where I could define my own worth. I thought about Marcus, my mentor, and the stories he told me about the open loop. He was right. The loop never closes because they accept you. The loop closes because you stop waiting for them to do so. The validation I had been seeking was a mirage, shimmering and beautiful but ultimately made of heat and air. The reality was the steering wheel in my hands, the engine humming beneath me, and the vast, unwritten future stretching out ahead. I was leaving behind the girl I loved, the town that tolerated me, and the family that judged me. It hurt. It hurt in a deep, aching way that I knew would linger for years. But beneath the pain was a bedrock of dignity that felt immovable. I had walked into the lion's den, not to be eaten, but to count their teeth and walk out again. I was alone in the car, moving at 65 miles per hour through the dark, but for the first time in my life, I didn't feel lonely. I felt complete. The final lesson wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving myself right.